Hello, my name is Susan Perrow, and I love to write stories for children, and I especially love to tell stories to children. And the story I'm going to tell you today is from a long, long time ago. It's a fairy tale, and it's called The Elves and the Shoemaker. There was once a shoemaker who had become so poor that he only had enough money left to buy leather to make one more pair of shoes. That evening he went into his workshop. He spread the leather out on the workbench, and he slowly cut out the pieces and left the work waiting for the morning. Then the shoemaker and his wife went to bed. While they were sleeping, something happened. Pull the thread and stitch the shoe. Pull it tight and that will do. Fairy fingers, nimble light, first the left and then the right. When the shoemaker woke the next morning, he went into his workshop to start work. And there, to his surprise, on the workbench was a beautifully made pair of shoes. He picked them up and looked at them, inside and out. What beautiful stitching! What fine work! He put them in the window, and very soon a customer came in, paid more than the usual amount for the shoes, and took the shoes away. Now the shoemaker had enough money to buy leather to make 2 pairs of shoes. That evening he went into his workshop, spread the leather out on the workbench, cut out the pieces, ready for work the next morning. Then the shoemaker and his wife went to bed. While they were sleeping, something happened. Pull the thread and stitch the shoe. Pull it tight and that will do. Fairy fingers, nimble light, first the left and then the right. The next morning, when the shoemaker went into his workshop, waiting on the workbench were 2 beautifully made pairs of shoes. Such beautiful stitching, such fine work. The shoemaker put them in the window, and very soon 2 customers came in, paid more than the usual amount for the shoes, and took the shoes away. Now the shoemaker had enough money to buy leather to make 4 pairs of shoes. And so it went on. Every evening the shoemaker would cut out the leather and leave the work waiting on the workbench. And every morning the work had been done. One day the shoemaker said to his wife, "I think we should stay up tonight and see who could be visiting us, who could be doing such beautiful work." So that evening, the shoemaker and his wife left the lamp burning, and they hid behind the curtains. And they watched, they waited, and they waited, and they watched. And at the stroke of midnight, they saw come dancing into the room 2 tiny little men. Not a stitch of clothing did they have on. They jumped up on the workbench, and with their tiny little fairy hammers and their tiny fairy needles, they set to work. Pull the thread and stitch the shoe. Pull it tight and that will do. fairy fingers, nimble light, first the left and then the right. When the little men had finished, they quickly ran out of the room. And the shoemaker and his wife thought they would make special gifts for these little folk who'd been so kind to them. So the next day they set to work. The shoemaker's wife pulled out her knitting needles and her sewing basket, and she knitted 2 tiny little hats, and she stitched and sewed 2 tiny shirts, and stitched and sewed some more 2 tiny pairs of pants. And the shoemaker spread out a tiny piece of leather and cut out and hammered and stitched 2 tiny pairs of shoes. They put the clothes and shoes on the workbench, and that evening, leaving the lamp burning, they hid behind the curtains. They watched, they waited, and they waited, and they watched. And at the stroke of midnight, they watched as the 2 little men came dancing into the room. They jumped up on the workbench, ready to start work. But there was no leather waiting for them. What could these things be, they wondered. Then they started to try them on. They tried on the little hats, and they fitted perfectly. They tried on the 2 little shirts. They fitted perfectly. They tried on the tiny pairs of pants. They fitted perfectly. And lastly, they tried on the tiny pairs of shoes, and they fitted perfectly. Then they began to dance around, holding hands on the top of the workbench, singing, "Happy little men are we, gaily dressed as you can see, no more shoemakers to be." And they jumped off the workbench and ran out of the room, never to be seen again. But the shoemaker and his wife, who were kind to those that were good to them, lived happily for the rest of their lives. A story, let it come, let it flow. A story, let it come, let it go.